Hi, I'm Duncan from Leaf Root and Fruit Gardening Services, and today's video is all about rental gardens. Rental gardens can be challenging because the length of your tenancy may be a bit uncertain. You may be on a 12-month lease, you may be on month to month, you may have been fortunate enough to negotiate a long-term lease. Either way, chances are your rental property is not going to be your forever home. So therefore, focusing on gardens that are movable and portable and on quick harvest is going to be the key to getting the most out of your space. A great relationship with your landlord can mean a great rental garden for you. However, some landlords may not be overly supportive of what you're trying to do. So it's up to you to decide whether you're going to ask for permission or forgiveness. If you are going to go down the path of asking for permission, it's probably best to have that chat with the landlord before you sign the lease agreement. That way you can iron out any details and make sure you're not locked into a property where a landlord is not going to be supportive of your gardening plans. Alternatively, asking for forgiveness could be okay as well, provided you make the property good. You should be able to get your bond back as long as you return the garden to the state that it was. So focusing only on gardening activities that have limited permanent impact on the garden is the key to getting your bond back. I've lived in many rental properties over the years, and each time I've had a garden. I've gardened in pots. I've gardened in raised garden beds made out of reclaimed timber. I've gardened in the ground. I've even had livestock such as chickens. Renters are at the mercy often of their landlords, and so tenancy is not always secure. Therefore, I encourage most renters to focus on growing quick growing crops. That is, crops that you can sow and quickly obtain a harvest from. Leafy greens and herbs are great for this. You could plant some lettuce seed or lettuce seedlings, and within 6 to 8 weeks, you could be harvesting your first lettuces. They're fairly simple to grow. You don't need any special fertilizers or any special care. You don't need to worry about flowers being pollinated to produce fruit. They're something that you can cut and come again. So you can harvest some big leaves off the plant, let it regrow, and then harvest again. So you can get meal after meal after meal from growing leafy greens. If you've got the space, sure, think about growing some root crops or maybe some fruit crops such as cucumbers and tomatoes. But as a primary consideration, you should be growing leafy greens. For those of you growing veggies or even fruit in pots, good quality potting mix is going to be essential to your success. Now, good quality doesn't necessarily mean expensive. There's a lot of expensive potting mixes out there that perform terribly. And conversely, there's a lot of cheap potting mixes that perform fairly well. So make sure you get a good quality potting mix. Another thing to consider when growing things in pots is to get the biggest pot or container that your budget can afford. You're going to have far better success growing lots of plants in one pot, one big pot, rather than trying to, say, grow 3 or 4 herbs individually in small pots. A big pot like this is going to create a more resilient ecosystem for them, and together they'll survive and thrive a lot better than they would individually. And while you're at it, don't forget a saucer to put underneath each pot. This will catch any excess water that runs off and feed it back up through the soil to the plants via capillary action. Growing fruit trees in pots can be a great addition to your rental property. However, there's a few important considerations that you need to make. And the first one is, why are you growing fruit trees in pots? Are you growing fruit trees to, for example, get a head start on potentially a future forever garden? In which case I'd probably discourage you from doing that. Now, the idea of this would be to, say, start growing some trees, get them quite large and established and fruiting in a pot, and then take it in a couple of years' time to whatever forever garden you end up in and planting that in the garden to get a head start. The reason why I say probably best not to do that is those fruit trees in pots over time will get very, very pot bound, so the roots will go round and round and round. And the trees are not going to be necessarily as resilient or healthy in the long run as if you start from scratch with a dwarf bare-rooted fruit tree. So perhaps not trying to get a jump start on a forever home, but what they're great for is helping you learn more about fruit trees, learn more about fruit tree pruning, espaliers such as this one. It could be fruit tree grafting you might be learning from, and you're also obtaining a yield. You know, I grew lots and lots of fruit trees in pots as a renter, and most of those pots, however, did not make it into our final forever home garden. We gave them away, we sold them, and most of those trees are still in pots. We did plant a few sentimental trees out into the garden, but they were very much the exception rather than the rule. Now, when you're growing fruit trees in pots, I need you to stop and have a think about what you're trying to do, because there's a couple of important things to consider. Probably the main one is the rootstock that you're growing the trees on. So these two apple trees here are grown on different rootstocks. Rootstocks refer to the root system, so these trees are grafted. They're essentially somebody takes a stick from a known variety of apple tree and they graft it using a grafting knife onto an existing root system, and that grows into a new tree. And then you get the characteristics of the fruit from the scion, the stick that you graft on the top, and the rootstock determines a lot of the characteristics of the tree, so things like disease resistance and the types of soil that it will grow in, but most importantly it determines how big that tree will get. So this apple tree here is on a rootstock called MM102. It will grow into a tree about 5 metres by 5 metres if you plant it in the ground, perhaps a bit smaller when it's pot bound and prevented from getting much bigger there. This tree, on the other hand, is planted on what we call an M9 rootstock. It keeps the tree quite small. This tree will never get much taller than this. It might get a little bit wider, and it's what we often train into what we call a step over apple. So if this was in the ground, you could literally step over the top of this apple tree. It's used for lining courtyards and potager gardens and the like. So rootstock consideration is really important. I generally encourage you to get dwarfing rootstock. The exception to that is citrus. Usually I advise people to go for a full-size rootstock for citrus, but all your stone fruit, your apples, your pears, definitely aim for dwarfing rootstock. As an example, this peach tree here that's just losing some of its autumn foliage, it's what we call a super dwarf tree. Now this tree produces probably around 20 peaches a year for me. Full-size peaches, very juicy, tasty peaches, but the tree itself is now, I think, about 8 or 9 years old. I never prune it, yet it produces about 20 peaches a year. So rootstock selection is really, really important with your fruit trees. Another important factor to think about with your fruit trees is the potting mix that the tree grows in. So using a good quality potting mix, especially one that's quite light, will make it easy to transport the fruit trees when you move from property to property. These espaliers here are challenging to move, but you can fit a good 4 or 5 trees sideways along a trailer and move them relatively easily. When you're thinking about moving fruit trees, particularly deciduous ones, try and aim to move those trees when they're dormant in winter. It will make it a lot easier than having all the foliage damaged as the trailer whistles through in the breeze, damaging all the leaves. Another important consideration for your fruit trees are the pot size. Now, the pot size is going to vary a little bit, but generally speaking, this is the smallest size pot that I'd try and grow a fruit tree in. It's a 50 centimetre pot. After that, you're going to want to pot it up every year or two. So from a 50 centimetre pot, this is a 70 litre pot, up to maybe a 110 litre pot. So potting up every year or two, making sure that you're keeping the nutrients topped up with plenty of fertiliser. Because you're not starting with fresh potting mix each year, the nutrients are going to get depleted quite quickly. So you're going to need to keep adding lots of worm castings and fertilisers and things to keep them happy. And other than that, it's just a matter of training the trees if you wish. You can leave these trees as a freestanding tree, full size, but I like the espalier style because then you can grow them along a fence line or against a building wall. We use these bamboo canes, heavy duty bamboo canes with some ties to tie it all together. And yeah, it's pretty easy to train and pretty easy to move. The other thing to think about is adding a saucer underneath your pots. So in summer, particularly, spring, summer and autumn, you want to have saucers underneath your potted fruit trees, but then take them away in winter because that can lead to, leaving the saucers there can lead to root rot over the winter. So your trees will be healthier if they've got saucers underneath them for 3 months of the year. That will help retain moisture in the pots and also help stop the trees from sending their roots down and growing into the soil underneath, which then means when it comes time to move the tree, you won't be able to do so because the roots will have the tree fixed firmly in place. So certainly consider growing fruit trees in pots. Avoid doing it to get a head start on a forever home, but thinking about the rootstocks that you're using and the size of the pots that you're growing the trees in. For renters looking to take their productive gardens to the next level, I highly recommend you include some berries in your system. Berries can be incredibly productive in pots. They don't take up much room. Raspberries such as this, if you plant them out into the garden, they'll tend to spread and take over the whole space. So they need to be constrained by a pot or a raised bed anyway. Autumn fruiting raspberries don't get quite as long as summer fruiting ones, so perhaps focus on them. And they'll tend to produce a lot of canes, which means you can divide them and share them with friends, or if you're ever fortunate enough to get a forever home, you'll be able to divide them up and very quickly plant out a large space with raspberries to really get a yield early on. Other berries such as blueberries need amazing drainage. So if you're to plant them into most of Melbourne's heavy soils, they're going to struggle or even die. So regardless of whether you're a renter or a homeowner, your blueberries need to be planted in pots. Blueberries get about 2 metres tall by about 1.5 metres wide. They have stunning autumn foliage and can produce kilos of fruit. Strawberries are another great introduction into your garden. You can grow them in small pots, big pots. You can grow them in raised beds. Our children love them. They'll be so incredibly productive in a small space. Caneberries such as loganberries and thornless blackberries can be very, very productive, but be warned, they are quite vigorous. Some of their canes will get up to about 4 metres long, so they'll quickly swamp a small space. So for you small space gardeners, maybe give them a miss. I found jostaberries and gooseberries really struggle to produce much yield in pots, so they're another one that I'd give a miss if you're struggling for space. Now, if you're going to grow berries, you can probably plant most of them into a pot as small as about 30 centimetres when they're quite a small berry plant, but then you're going to want to pot them up every year or two. So taking them from a 30 centimetre pot to something like this 40 centimetre pot, then after a year or two up to a 50 centimetre pot, and so on. When you do that, you're going to give them fresh potting mix and room to thrive, which is going to increase their productivity. That's my number one tip for rental gardeners. Include berries in your garden. One important aspect of your rental property is going to be some kind of composting solution. Now, it might be tempting to go for one of those cheap bottomless bins. You can often find them in hard rubbish. The idea is that you set them up somewhere in the garden, you add lots of your kitchen scraps to them and they break down over time, and then slide the bin off and move it to the next location in your garden to start the composting process there. The reality of them is, though, that they tend to attract a lot of rodents, rats and mice, who burrow in underneath. Then you effectively turn them into rat hotels because you come along while they're living in there, you lift the lid off, you're feeding them your kitchen scraps every day, giving them room service, and then they make nightly excursions out into your garden and destroy your valuable produce. If you are going to use one of those rat hotels, then I highly recommend you put some rodent mesh underneath the bottom of the bin to stop them burrowing in underneath. However, I find a better solution is something like this, a worm farm. Worm farms are great because they actively decompose the kitchen scraps and vegetable matter that you're putting in there, which means it takes a lot less time to generate that compost. They're rodent proof. I particularly like this worm farm because it's got a huge volume, takes up a low footprint in the garden, and it's pretty simple to use. Now the worm farm is called a hungry bin worm farm. You simply open up the lid, add your kitchen straps in top, the worms do their thing, and after a couple of months you'll be able to unclip this base here, take the worm castings off, and you can dig them through the garden before you're planting seeds and seedlings. You can top dress established plants to give them a bit of a kick along. And don't overlook the worm wee or worm juice in the base. You can take that and tip that into a watering can. I usually dilute it about 50-50. Some people dilute it even more to make it go a bit further in the garden. And you can water the leaves of your plants and they'll give them an extra kick along with lots of minerals and nutrients as a form of foliar spray. Other composting solutions might include chickens, hot composting, tumblers, but for me really a worm farm is the go-to item for a rental garden. It's pretty easy to pick up and take it with you. It's quite portable and it'll just sit in a quiet, out of the way shady spot and do its thing. Most garden ecosystems will benefit from the integration of livestock into them. There's a few options that are available to a rental gardener. Probably the most obvious choice are things like chickens. You can build a fairly low cost, easily dismantled chicken coop and run in your backyard. You can often do this using reclaimed materials. Temporary fencing can allow them to integrate through the garden, and where they'll help do pest control and provide you with eggs. For those of you with smaller spaces, you might want to consider something like quail. Quail don't need much room, the downside being they only produce small eggs. I think one often overlooked livestock that you can integrate into your rental garden are bees. Bees only take up a small footprint, and they're actually fairly portable. They're easy to relocate. You just need to remember that bees should only be moved either a metre every couple of days or at least 10 kilometres. Moving them this great distance allows them to reset their internal navigation and settle into their new space. So if you're going to move house, you'll either need to move greater than 10 kilometres or find a friend who's willing to house your bees for a week or two while they reset their navigation systems, and then after they've reset, you can then move them to your new house and both settle in together and reset your systems. So I think bees are a great option for small spaces. If both of these options seem a bit too much of a commitment for you, then perhaps at least consider adding something like a bird bath into your garden to help encourage wildlife. Or at the very least, adding some kind of insect or bee hotel that'll attract some beneficial insects in to help control pests and some pollinators to help with pollinating your vegetable produce. So as we've seen, rental garden properties can be very productive spaces. Just to recap, focus on growing leafy greens and other quick to harvest veggies. Avoid growing fruit trees for the sake of getting a head start on a forever home, but they're great opportunities to practice grafting and pruning and maintaining espaliers. Growing berries is my number one tip for rental gardeners. They need to be grown in pots anyway. Worm farms are great solutions for composting for rental gardeners, and you can easily take a worm farm like the Hungry Bin worm farm with you wherever you move. And consider keeping bees. They don't take up much space and they're fairly easy to relocate from garden to garden to garden. My name's Duncan. I'm from Leaf Root and Fruit Gardening Services. Thanks for watching.